fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Okay, and we're back with Barr McClellan, and pleasure to have you here. How are you doing today?
Alan, I'm doing just fine. Thank you very much for having me. But the big question, I guess, is how are you doing?
Actually, overall, pretty good. I'm pretty happy with things. A little bit disheartened from, this is our month of the JFK and RFK sort of conspiracies and research. A little bit disheartening. I'm sort of sad from all the different discussions I've been having and evidence I've heard, and I always sort of looked at the time of the 60s as a great time, and with a lot of good people and doing good things, and it's kind of disheartening to hear some of the things that went on.
It really is, and when you turn it over and you see the downside, the dark underside, like I mentioned, we have two options on movies for my first book, and we're working on a book of treatments, different ways to approach the story of what happened, not the story, the history of what happened. And it becomes, you search for a title, and right now the working title is Murder Horrific. So, like you were saying, the 60s had a lot of real progress, but at the same time, its dark underside is, and it's part of the story, history, but it is awful. It's just awful.
Yeah. It's just sort of. I think because I was young, of course, very young, and it just sort of seemed like an ideal time. Like you had, you could have faith in people, especially when you're young. You don't really understand politics or any of that sort of ideas, but I just sort of had a lot of faith, even in people like not only Kennedy and the things you hear and the good things you hear when you're young, right? But also even Lyndon Johnson, which I I think it sort of shakes your foundation a little. It's sort of where I'm at.
That is so true, and that is why many people are really defending him beyond redemption. I mean, there's no way to really defend him if you look into the case, listen to the insiders, know the man for what he was. There's no way you can justify any praise for the man. But again, this is part of the history that I've been able to hear from people, other insiders, and it really lays it out, and it does. It answers a lot of your what you were just you're expressing your concerns. I mean, it was a time of Camelot,
right? And
along comes this horrendous murder, horrendous assassination, and you stop and you look, and what I was able to bring out and to realize was something the Warren Commission said almost on its first day. We are not a banana republic. Well, what that meant was our government would never be involved in a coup d'etat. Nobody with the government would do something like that. We're too good. What they didn't know is what I was able to bring out. Back in Texas, there was this fellow named Ed Clark, the secret boss of Texas, the only man Johnson trusted, and he had a banana republic in Texas where he was running the show completely. What he wanted, he got. And so your perception would have been accurate as far as the national scene, but when the national scene bowed down to this product of a banana republic. Well, it was inexcusable.
Yeah, certainly was. So, and to defend them, I don't know what they're defending. I can't defend someone like that. And not only that, I've also, in all the research, I hear all the tapes of Johnson and with Hoover and all the different tapes that they have now of, and it's just it's almost shocking to hear how he was.
It really is, and a lot of people, and again I go back to the fog of history, they'll turn to these tapes and say, oh, listen, L.B.J. never admitted to killing the president. Well, he's not going to.
No.
But the bigger point was the tapes didn't start until after, Dallas, and when he moved into the Oval Office. So they're going to leave that out. But if you listen carefully, one thing about L.B.J. was he could compartmentalize things better than anyone. And, for example, there is one tape where he's talking with some friends about getting some money out of some counties back in Texas. And Johnson said, well, we can't talk about that anymore. It's being recorded.
Yeah.
So he knew what to say and what not to say. I mean, what he could admit and not admit is a story in itself, and it goes back many years before he ever became president. You can't say it's funny. It's not at all. It's just really strange that he could do some things he did. Like, for example, he admitted there was a conspiracy, and that was kind of a challenge. Yeah, there was a conspiracy. My side pulled it off. See if you can crack it. It is so well covered up, you'll never find out that there was a conspiracy. Explain it is impossible, but again, the man could compartmentalize and even talk against himself.
Yeah. So, what do you think it came from for him? Like, how do you describe his background? I mean, he was from Texas.
It is really well described by several historians, and Robert Cairo is probably the best one on those early years, those years before he was elected to the Senate in that stolen election back in 1948. He was always compelled to move forward. His father had gotten into bankruptcy, and his mother had been so disappointed, and she had really pushed her son, Johnson, to do the best he could and not to make any mistakes. And this, your mother's voice is a powerful voice.
Oh, yeah.
But he always had this ambition, but at the same time, he was able to manipulate all through his career, a victory here, a victory there, even though it wasn't a victory. I mean, for example, he stole being Speaker for the small house, the representatives' aides, all there, they called them back then, secretaries. And he manipulated that vote. He manipulated the vote to get elected in college, for which he was suspended and spent a year off doing some sort of public service. He was elected to Congress with a minority vote. I mean, he had 37% of the vote back in 1938. What happened, the congressman died all of a sudden, and they had to call a special election, and it was set up to be, high man wins. Well, he didn't win that one. And then 48 comes along, and he steals that election. So he had this overwhelming ambition. It's almost existential in the sense that whatever I want, I mean, it's the center of existential theory. I think that you get what you want. You really get out there and pull it off. Nietzsche did that. And don't let me wander too much here, but Kierkegaard was the opposite side. He was so committed to his religion that he would do anything he believed God wanted. That would be the guy who follows the law, right?
Yeah.
Like John Kennedy. On the other hand, you had Lyndon Johnson, who had absolutely no parameters of what was right or wrong. And it all comes out of this growing up years, which were tempered again. Alan, let me just add this too. He grew up in a time when, slap leather, six-shooters were carried around strapped to your side in Texas. When they had the Ku Klux Klan almost electing a governor, when you had lynching going on, no respect for human life, really. So this murderous trend, this murderous thinking, was part of what he grew up with, and he lived it out.
And in talking to people this month, one of them is Professor Corner, John Corner. He sort of described him as having quite a few mental illnesses. He was sociopath is what he called them, and paranoia and bipolar.
Yes, and let me explain that when he came back from Washington, when he couldn't stay in and pulled out of the election in 1968, he went into deep depression. And through the law firm, we hired a psychiatrist. Now, this happened before I joined the law firm. Let me put it this way: before I was a partner, and I found out about it later. But he had this psychiatrist who was trying something new and different, and it was working against suicide thoughts, trying to bring him around. The last time I saw Johnson, it was when they dedicated the L.B.J. library in Austin, and he was there under one of the fountains talking to Ed Clark, the only man he trusted, and my law partner. And I walked over to visit with him for a minute, and you could see that the evening, all the congratulations and praise that was given Johnson had helped. But he quickly went back into it, and two things we know for sure happened. One is, after he went to the inauguration of Nixon, he came back home and started smoking. And even his own daughter said, "You're going to kill yourself." And he said, "It's my life." He had reached a breaking point. I mean, people reach this point, and he was so depressed from everything else. But another thing happened in his mental makeup that we know about. A lot of it we can talk about from his, observing him and all, but what he did is important too. He became a Christadelphian. Now, this is a group that believes the Jews are going to inherit the world, and if the world should end, it would be okay because the Jewish race and Jewish religion, the Jewish people, would be there to take over. And this kind of thinking is millennial type thinking, where it's okay for the end of the world, and it's part of his makeup at this late stage in his life. And he has gotten away. He had, and what they're trying to do is cover it up. That he did become a Christadelphian in his last years. It was something his uncle had been and his father had been. It was kind of an offbeat religion there. But to my mind, you can interpret that as being suicidal and committed to even the country. It was that awful. And so, yes, he can be a sociopath. He can be, unconcerned about legal standards in every which way. And again, it comes back to what I mentioned earlier, an existential belief that what I want to do is what's right, and that's that. Don't get in my way. And he had that. I had in my book, the first book, the Blood, Money, and Power book, I had identified the penthouse records. And these were records the law firm kept up in the penthouse of the bank building we were in. And Clark had put them behind a fence. It was strange. Usually lawyers, can see any kind of records they want to. And we could have seen those, but we had to ask. And it was recorded. It was about the only thing we worried too much about. But if those records could be recovered, I think you find in there how the firm hired this psychiatrist and what he reported back. Of course, it's privileged because he would be an employee of the lawyer, and the privilege would apply. So to get back to it and try and answer your question, I'm looking at things I can identify to be evidence of the state of mind he had, of things he had done. But we need those records, and if they could be recovered, I think it'd really answer the question.
Right. Yeah, it would help. And so actually, I didn't do this at the beginning, and I should have. So for the listeners that don't know who you are or haven't done the research or any reading about it, describe actually some of your background for them, so they understand that. Where are you coming from?
Oh, yes, and I was a lawyer and partner with Ed Clark, who I mentioned earlier was the secret boss of Texas and Johnson's only trusted friend. I went to law school in Texas, ended up with good grades and a good record on the bar exam. I guess part of the story there was my father-in-law was dean of the law school. And if you remember The Paper Chase, which I believe was a 1960s movie, that's kind of what it was like, having the dean as your father-in-law. But he was a great man. He really was, and he set a standard for me. But there I was in Austin, finishing up law school, and had a child. My wife and I, we had our first son, and it was time to get a job. And I took a job in Washington with the Federal Power Commission, which regulates oil and gas, very important to Texas. And Clark hired me when I finished service I agreed to in Washington, and that was in 1965, so it was 2 years, or a year and a half after the assassination, and immediately got into the legal life in Austin. Had my own TV show, The Law and You, which was okay because it was right before the NFL game of the week, and had some pretty good cases. Blocked a highway in San Antonio at the Supreme Court level. But with the law firm, it became pretty obvious once I saw and was told that Clark had planned the assassination, something I didn't believe, but one of my partners said it. And what's said in a law firm is sacrosanct. It's what we know about what we are doing and did. And I gradually drifted away from it. And at one point there, they asked me to represent this guy named Oscar Wyatt. And there was no way I could do that. I had been representing some other clients on the opposite side, but they wanted me to do it, and they said anything Leon Jaworski wants, we do. Of course, Jaworski would be later prosecutor, and he would also be involved in the Nixon case, and he would be in charge of the Texas investigation into the assassination. So he was a very key man. I said, I can't do that. And they told me 3 times, you got to do it. Whatever he wants, we do. And I said, I'm not doing it. And so, my term there with the firm was over, and I left, set up my own firm. Went through a fight with the Clark firm. His big connection, I think this is true of most of the big law firms, is they have a bank behind them, like he was chairman of the bank. This gives you the right to do something important. If you have someone you don't like, unlike the Godfather, you don't have to just kill them, but you call the note if they have one. So they called the note. I ended up in a big fight with them, with the bank that did it. Ultimately, the bank went into reorganization, which meant I couldn't sue them anymore, and everything was thrown out a few years later. And that's when I started investigating what I knew about the Clark firm and the assassination. At this point, this was in '94, I started working with some other researchers and decided to redo some of the work the Warren Commission had done just to see how bad it was, and we uncovered fingerprints from a fellow who had killed for Johnson back in 1950, and we had his prints there in the local police office, and hired. Well, we didn't hire him. He was willing to make the study blind, but as a study, philosophical, and he made a match to this fellow named Mac Wallace to a fingerprint that was recovered on the 6th floor of the school book depository in Dallas. And this, as far as I was concerned, was again really good evidence to go forward with what I knew had happened. And it was presented in due course and is in the book with a discussion of how it made the case for what I knew and could present in a book.
Why do you think that kind of evidence wasn't used?
Well, the print evidence is a specific and good example. They brought in 2 really top-notch handwriting experts to prove that Oswald was there. And at the last minute, one of the lawyers working with the Warren Commission said, hey, wait a minute, we have a whole lot more fingerprints we've recovered, and we haven't identified them. Somebody's going to say there's a conspiracy. So they did this super rapid-fire analysis and ended up with 2 unidentified prints, and a palm print and a fingerprint. And when we could go back over it and could see the mistakes that had been made, the identification could be made that it matched to this fellow Mac Wallace who had killed 4 Johnson, like I say, back in 1950. He did it again in 61, but that's another part of the story here, really. Anyway, Warren moved too fast, and the crime scene they analyzed has been reanalyzed and reanalyzed, and to the point where it's very difficult to get solid evidence. I mean, people are going to say, well, we know there was a 4th bullet because there was a tree branch here and it got nicked. How do they know that? How can they be so sure? This is the kind of, and speculation is the only way to describe it, that the Warren Commission made to prove there was only one shooter. They were blind to anything else because, as I mentioned earlier, they said, hey, this is not a banana republic here in Washington. Like I said, it was back in Texas. Anyway, they missed so much, or they pushed things so hard to make them fit their theory, like the single bullet. I mean, that is just about as impossible as you can get. The head snap, the head shot on when President Kennedy was hit in the head, he goes backwards. And they said it came from behind him. Well, it had to go forward if it hit him from behind. I mean, that's just the nature of bullets. They go forward. They don't bounce around and go back. They also had, and this one I just, it maybe makes the point answers the point you asked better than anything. They said, well, Oswald was the marksman. I have a friend, he's a former Marine. He said, if you're a marksman, you're one step above being flushed out of the service because you can't shoot straight. So it was this kind of thing. They just construed everything, misconstrued everything. And it's where I said they never could have made a case beyond a reasonable doubt, which they should have been able to do if they'd listened to and seen what they were doing and had looked beyond, looked for the guy in the Banana Republic, Johnson. They would have found something very, very different. The way I put it in my sequel to the first book, which title is Verdict, is that they didn't look at Johnson. And the first thing you look for in any criminal investigation is motive. Who had the biggest motive? Just to know it. And they didn't. What they did, though, on the other hand, I mean, they did that to protect the president. On the other hand, they did a huge disservice to the one who suffered the most, and that was John Kennedy. If they had taken a look at cui bono and cui malo, who benefited, who lost, it would have been an entirely different analysis, I believe.
Do you think that they did that? Like, what was the purpose of them doing this? Was it just to resolve it quickly and let American life go on, or was it on purpose? They wanted to cover up for Johnson?
Well, you know, Alan, I think there's a lot of ways you can look at it because so many people were involved. I think what you just said is right. There were many in Washington who didn't want to face the fact that it might be a conspiracy and it might involve the government. Everyone knew what a bad guy Johnson was. I mean, they had 3 Senate investigations going on the day of the assassination. They were supposed to kick off the following Monday. They all got buried. They couldn't name the successor president. They couldn't even consider it. And there were those who knew. I'll give you a good example. Senator John Williams of Delaware. He was pressing hard and fought to the bitter end to keep the investigations going. But he was just one man left. It was this thing, we had to protect the country. The rumor gets out, oh, there's going to be a war because this might be Cuba and Russia working together. And there was this fear. In fact, that's kind of the fear of a nuclear war that impressed the Chief Justice Warren to take the job. And Johnson pushed him hard on that point. But to make it just one man, one gunner, one sniper was very, very important to keep it from spreading to, and they didn't know where it could go, but they had a pretty good idea that Johnson just might turn up among the, shall we say, usual suspects.
Yeah, I look back at it now. It seems pretty obvious, but so what was he trying? What were they trying to investigate him for?
He had been working with Bobby Baker as his best buddy, who had been his secretary in the Senate and had arranged everything like Senate hearings, extra clothes for a senator who might have to stay over for a vote, women for whoever might need them at the Quorum Club in the Congressional Hotel across the street from the Capitol. Bobby Baker was very important to him. And when Johnson had become president, when he became vice president, that ended. But Bobby Baker stayed there, and he did a few things that were going to be investigated. And there was the thinking that the fear that some of this that Bobby Baker had done earlier would land on Johnson's lap. The specific one, he had arranged advertising on Johnson's TV back in Austin, his TV station, the one I had a program on. Anyway, they had arranged advertising there, and there was a kickback. There was a kickback for everything Johnson did. He took a commission on everything. I'll get to that in just a sec, but that was one thing that was going to land on Johnson's lap, and they just couldn't have it. There was another one. I'd mentioned this fellow, Mac Wallace, whose print was identified. We had identified on being on the 6th floor, and he had murdered a man in 1950 on behalf of Johnson because Johnson's sister was getting involved in a sex circle in Austin. And this was right after Johnson had stole the 48 election. Everybody in the state was getting ready to run against him. Well, they couldn't let any scandal show up. So Wallace goes in and just shoots this fella, Henry Kinzer, just shoots him dead 4 times in this little shop he had, a little putt-putt golf shop. And he gets off with a 5-year suspended sentence, which is another part of the Banana Republic. But again, I'm kind of jumping around here, but what I'm getting back to is Wallace was involved with this fellow named Billy Saul Estes, who had been involved with Johnson ever since right after the 48 election. Johnson had his sights in. I mean, he was moving up, and he needed money. And one of his friends, Billy Saul Estes, was really good at raising money and making it work. He raised a lot of money for Johnson, and again, the commission applied 10% kickback on federal money that was given to Estes to go back to Johnson. Well, in the course of things, these crimes surfaced, and an investigator for the Department of Agriculture was going hard and strong after Estes, which meant he was going to uncover Johnson. Johnson has a meeting with Wallace and Estes in Washington on Inauguration Week. I mean, John Kennedy has been inaugurated. It's his week. And Johnson knows this investigation is coming to a head, and so he meets, and this is well established. He tells Wallace, go talk to him, tell him we're going to give him a better job in Washington and to drop this case. If we don't do it, then he's got to go, quote, unquote. And I can say that because the investigator, a fellow named Clint Peoples, who was a Texas Ranger and U.S. Marshal, recorded it from what Estes was telling him. So here's this, Wallace has taken Marshall out to his ranch, Marshall's ranch, telling him to get out of it, and he won't get out of it. So they kill him. Well, first of all, they hit him aside the head because Wallace could get pretty angry when he wanted to, knocked him out. So they said, we can now fake it a suicide. We'll put a plastic bag over his head, turn on his pickup, and run the exhaust by it. Well, that got started, but then they heard a car driving around in the neighborhood out on this ranch. You could hear it off in the distance, and so they had to stop. We got to move quicker. So they laid him out on the seat of the pickup and shot him 5 times in the stomach. Now, he was unconscious, probably, when this was happening. 5 times. It was a bolt-action rifle that you had to, bolt and rebolt for every bullet you fired. And 3 of the 5 shots were fatal. So somehow Henry Marshall was able to shoot himself at least 2 times after he was dead. Johnson, because of his control, was able to get, through Clark, was able to get the sheriff to say, suicide. Well, and before they could do anything else, they buried him. So, case closed, suicide. And that's the way it looked for about a year, but then Estes, and again, as these things fester, they kind of get to boiling, he gets indicted. And he rushes to Johnson for help, and Johnson won't speak to him, even though Johnson had said, hey, look, this is okay to do this commission back to you, back to me, and if you ever get in trouble, I'll help you. One lie after another. Anyway, that was coming back to a head. That was brewing in the background as an investigation in 1963, just before the assassination. So it was this kind of thing that was hitting Johnson hard, threatening him. And the rumor was out that Kennedy was going to drop him.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
If he gets dropped, he no longer has the immunity that goes with the presidency. Or he thought he had. That's an open question, legal question still, but he thought he had the immunity of the president because he was vice president. Maybe so, but anyway, he was very afraid that he would be dropped and all this would just land on his desk or land on his back. And he was facing either the White House, he was one heartbeat away, as the old saying goes, or it was the jailhouse. And these kind of things will motivate you to do things, that aren't legal. But again, what does Johnson worry about legal? He had Texas covered through his good buddy back in Austin named Ed Clark. And I'm kind of laughing here, and it's not funny. Don't misunderstand me.
No.
But how grown men could get away with this is incredible, and yet he was able to do it.
Subject tonight is the JFK assassination. Our guest, Barr McClellan, and we'll be back right after these words. Now, I'd also heard that normally that Kennedy was not going to use him in the next term. But also when he was initially running, when they were in the 1960 Democratic Convention, that Kennedy was going to have Stuart Symington be his running mate.
That is very much the case. Johnson, of course, they'd been going at it pretty hard. Johnson had raised some questions about John Kennedy's health, and this was kind of a forbidden subject back in those days. And Bobby Kennedy was particularly angry for this happening during the campaign for the Democratic nomination. And John Kennedy was considering 2 or 3 others, but I think any candidate's going to have a list and be one to pick from one or the other. But a lot of pressure all of a sudden came up after John Kennedy was selected to turn to Lyndon Johnson to be sure and get the Southern vote. And Johnson, because of his because of his background, he was racist. I can just flat say it. He did nothing important to help African Americans, even while he was Senate Majority Leader. I mean, perfect example, the NAACP was formed for one reason, and that was to cut out the lynchings in the South. And they begged Johnson all the time, he was Majority Leader and even before, to support a bill to make it a federal crime. He wouldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And it really, when you stop and think on something like that, that is awful. And so you have Johnson kind of a natural, though, for the Southern vote. And he was powerful. Johnson, in forming his campaign for the Democratic nomination, had decided on getting the South as a block and then mountain states that he could pick up, he figured, from his Western background. Well, that was important for John Kennedy, too. And so with Johnson, it would add support in those states. And then it became some very top-notch, very powerful men at the convention, Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House, and a couple of others convincing John Kennedy to pick Lyndon Johnson. Now this was more than anything Bobby Kennedy could take, and he tried to get the decision reversed, but he couldn't. And so this tension between the two men, the president and the vice president, can be traced back to that. And of course, Bobby Kennedy was right there in the middle of it, and he was no friend of Johnson's.
Okay, so Johnson wasn't going to be used probably the next term. He was worried about prosecution. Was that the primary reasons behind the JFK assassination, you think?
I don't think it was the primary reason at all. I think it was been brewing, and you can trace it back to, again, some evidence we have of planning for the assassination going back to Sam Rayburn's funeral 2 years before the assassination. This Mac Wallace enlisted, he got a Native American from Oklahoma who was there at Sam Rayburn's funeral, a guy named Roy Factor, got him interested in shooting, and went to see him, see if he could take a long shot and how good he was. And they went to this Roy Factor's home and had him make a practice shot. So this was 2 years before the actual assassination. It was being planned, and if you really wanted to trace it back, it probably started when Henry Marshall, the agriculture agent, was killed, and killed by Mac Wallace. They had to be ready by Ed Clark, and he had to know that he had something in place in case it came to a head. And it did come to a head a year after the Marshall killing, when they indicted Billy Saul Estes. And that's when it started getting serious. So it wasn't that, Johnson had all of a sudden found out that he might be dropped, even though that rumor was floating around pretty actively that week before they go to Dallas. So it's this accumulation thing. Back to what you asked about earlier, what kind of person was Lyndon Johnson? Well, sociopath works. He was ready to do anything to become president.
So then he became president. Now the next term, when it came up, he actually withdrew, didn't he? He didn't run in 1968.
Right, and he couldn't. And this is a real interesting thing between the two men, Johnson and Clark, because Clark never forgave him for not running. Clark needed him. And this goes into what came out later, getting the bonus that Clark was able to commandeer after the assassination. He had to have it with Johnson in there for another 4 years because he was going to make that much more money. And Johnson, though, had reached a point, the best I can describe this is, where this Depression thing was coming back, the war was not going right. Johnson had been given this utter and complete power to wage nuclear war if he wanted to. I mean, this was when the Vietnam ordinance was first passed to go into Vietnam, defend America. Extraordinary power. And we built up to 500,000 men in Vietnam. It kept building up to win the war. And it was at the point where this power needed to be used, and Johnson couldn't. There was no way they were going to, the military or his advisors were going to let that happen. So you have this background, I guess, and it just added to his depression. And he, as depressed people will do, kind of give it up.
And now,
just too much, yeah.
And do you think the CIA was involved with this as well?
Oh yeah. What's happened? Back to my first book, Blood, Money, and Power. When it came out, it was kind of like going to court, and you lay it on the table, and you say, "Here's the charges against you. Now answer them." Well, I heard a lot of answers, and a lot of them were pretty critical. I mean, at one point there, I felt I'd been both firestormed and waterboarded. But I had a lot of support, too. And some of the support came from insiders who could identify the CIA that was involved. Now, in the history of the investigations, the official ones in Washington, the House Special Committee on the assassination concluded there was a conspiracy and that probably rogue agents of the CIA were involved, but they didn't know who they were. Well, this is another part of the story, and this is going to get more interesting. I mean, Alan, some of the names that come up, I mean, Trigger Jones and a few others are, well, unusual. The Smuggler's Hole is where the history really involves the CIA that I've been told about, the history. The Smuggler's Hole is a little place down in a little town called Eagle Pass, and it was the main road between Spain and Texas for many years, and Mexico and Texas later, of course. And it was where the smugglers could go through and not pay anything, free entry. Well, they started using that when Cuba fell through this fellow named Robert Bibb, and his father had been in Cuba when Teddy Roosevelt took his Rough Riders down there, and he got a contract to export deer tractors to Cuba. And they did it through the Smuggler's Hole. Well, now, they didn't go out at night and just go through this low-water crossing. But because he was director of the port, director of the border, he could say, go on through, even though it was forbidden at one point, well, after Castro took over and after the Bay of Pigs, to export weapons. And this guy, Robert Bibb, you gotta understand now, I'm covering a lot of ground here, was a roommate with Lyndon Johnson when he was in college. They were the best of friends and stayed that way. And Bibb helped JFK and arranged the honeymoon for him and Jackie in Acapulco. Big friend, close friend, guy able to do things. Well, there were 4 men involved in this smuggling operation. What they did was keep on moving weapons, and they were bringing drugs back, and they got the mafia involved in it, but they got caught. They got caught and charged after Lyndon Johnson left office because his power to pardon was no longer there. And they were all indicted in New Orleans. They were a fellow named Richard Harper and a Murray Kiesler, a Barry Seal, very famous guy in the assassination research, and a Marion Hagler. Well, one was on the board of the bank in Eagle Pass, the Bibb Bank. Barry Seal had been involved with the CIA as a pilot for many years. All of the so-called rogue CIA agents were involved in the smuggling operation, and when they were charged, they were defended by Ed Clark. Now, I mean, I don't know how much more of a circle you want to make, but here's where I was getting at earlier. This was all brought to my attention because this fellow named Jack Worthington came to see me. Like I say, I didn't go out digging up this information. It was just coming in the door. Jack Worthington was told by his mother that John Kennedy was his father. Now, Jack looks a lot like John Kennedy. And the case was presented to ABC and to a couple of other media outlets in New York. And Jack asked him, if you can establish that that John Kennedy was my father, a very important question for us guys. We need to know who our fathers was. And they agreed, the media agreed, okay, we'll do what we can to find a connection, and we'll keep it secret, unless we make the story and can bring it out and answer your question. Well, ABC was one of them, and they apparently reportedly stole some DNA somehow. And Ted Kennedy at the time found out about it, and he put the quietus on it. He said, you're not saying anything about that, or I'll own you. So the magazine kept up the study. ABC dropped out, looking for an honest way to find DNA, and they weren't having any luck until about a year after their investigation had started. And they called Jack and say, we've got it. We're sending down a private investigator protection. We've hired a media guy. We're getting ready to break it. I'll get back to you in a week. Well, in that time, they called Ted Kennedy, and he told him the same thing. If you bring this out, I'll own you. They dropped it. In dropping it, they were very unfair to Jack. But where Jack fit in, he could tell me about both sides here, because his mother was a Bibb. This tied it right into the little smuggler's hole and the rogue CIA agents. And you have this picture then that has emerged of a couple of CIA agents working with Mac Wallace, who was being directed by Ed Clark, putting together a plan to assassinate the president. It was a very close thing. It wasn't something that was announced at a board of directors at the CIA or anything. It was some rogue agents, like the House Special Committee said, and they worked with and were enlisted by Wallace and Clark to tie it in even further. Yeah. And Alan, are you with me? I'm covering a lot of ground here, but I'm bringing you all back to this little CIA point of contact.
Yeah, no, I'm there.
There was this guy, George de Mohrenschildt, yes. He was a friend of Oswald's. he also spent time with the Bibbs in Eagle Pass. And so if you need connection, I had earlier established a connection through Clark to Oswald, because one of my clients had been a fellow who owned a small pipeline up in the Texas Panhandle. And so there was a sort of a connection there, but now it is strong, because this George de Mohrenschildt was the fellow that took Oswald under his wing. He was a former Russian, and tried to get him jobs. But he was also working in the oil fields, and surely that's what brought him down to Eagle Pass. So you have this fellow Robert Bibb, who was a county judge at the time. His brother was the business manager of the Bibb family in Eagle Pass, and you can see how all the connections could be put together. And this planning, like I say, that started, what was it, 2 years? We know it was underway 2 years before the assassination, could be built up. And it didn't have to be, hey, you want to shoot the president? We've been approved by the CIA, their board of directors. It was all strictly off the cuff with people they knew they could trust not to talk. And that's who they could find through these many contacts out in the woods, so to speak, and bring together a team. For example, this Lloyd Factor that they enlisted, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'll shoot somebody. Meet me in Dallas." He shows up there on the 22nd. "We want you to shoot the president." He left. He wasn't going to have anything to do with it, but he didn't know about it until that day. And so I think the story you can put together, the history you can put together, is that they had the group together, and they had enough who were committed, and you could leave Oswald in as what he said he was, a patsy, and you could leave Lloyd Factor there to be another patsy, but he bowed out and left. It all ties together. You asked about the CIA being involved?
Yeah.
Yes, they were.
Yeah. And did they have their own reasons as well, do you think? Like, I mean, because some of the people I've talked to now said that they were running drugs out of Laos and Vietnam, and that was and they didn't want Kennedy to shut them down, and Kennedy wanted to kind of take apart the CIA.
I don't think it was the drugs as much as it was the Bay of Pigs. The CIA had put together that effort to overthrow Castro, and if you remember, back then, Robert Kennedy said, "We're not sending American airplanes in to support the freedom fighters in the Bay of Pigs." And of course, the Cuban army was able to overwhelm them. So the CIA blamed John Kennedy for that, and that was a real grievance for some of them. In fact, the one that I am most closely involved, most closely identified, corroborated, is a fellow named David Morales, and he was in charge of the CIA, shall we say, dark side operation, including the Bay of Pigs operation. But the drugs were there. Don't misunderstand me. That's how you could bring the mafia in, because one of the agents on the of these four that were identified that were involved with the bank in Eagle Pass, one of them was a mafia representative, and they were moving drugs. Now, I mean, that was another problem they had, and why they ended up indicted.
And so, have you talked to any of the Kennedy family or anybody on that side, and or if you heard anything about what they figure about this?
Yeah, I have, and I mean, that was, I don't know how to kind of put it, I get kind of emotional over this, because I admired Kennedy very much. I mean, you can talk about Camelot and all, and yes, he did a good job. He was a very good man, and he had some wonderful ideas, and he set the nation on the right track, something we're still doing thanks to decisions he made. And so I was very, I was a great admirer of John Kennedy. And when I started my investigation, when my book came out, it's when I started getting calls from the Kennedys. One of them was this fellow, Wilson Gathings, who was a Kennedy through Jackie's side of the family. A couple of more call and tell me how something needs to be done. One of them was the historian for the Kennedy family, really, who lived in Florida, and it was back when we were looking for the DNA, and she said, well, I have two things that you could use. One was an identification card John Kennedy used in the Pacific when he was, in the Navy there, and it was too far back to be able to use. They also said, I also have the gown in which he was christened. And my first question was, how many times has it been washed? Well, twice, and that was twice too many. It was that kind of contact. But the biggest contact in the Kennedy side was this lady, Meg Azani, who had dated John Jr., who had breakfast with Jackie, who had heard Jackie, who Meg said she mentioned John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson once, and there was silence, dead silence, for at least a minute. Jackie wasn't going to talk to him or allow him to be mentioned. And then Jackie resumed the conversation, not talking about Johnson at all. Meg said she shall never talk about that. I mean, she could tell me things from deep inside the Kennedy family, like Jackie could tell how she once told a fellow at a banquet that when the assassination happened, she almost lost her mind. I mean, you can't imagine how horrible it was for that person sitting right there, looking at her husband, and his head explodes. And she does all she can to help him. I mean, this is huge courage for Jackie to have been able to do these things. But Meg also had another deep, deep insight into the Kennedy family because she was dating John Kennedy Jr. And she was with him when they had one of the hearings at the House Special Committee. And John wrote a poem. He drafted a poem. This was a little Kennedy thing. When they were together, they'd write poems to each other. It was, I guess, a literary foundation for the family or something. But he wrote a little poem, and he called it The Penitent Society. And he was struggling. I mean, he was 16, 17 at the time. And but he was trying to get America to say that it was a horrible assassination and it was a conspiracy, and we need a penitent nation, someone to take steps to right the wrong. That's the first written evidence that came out of my contacts with the Kennedys. But she could also tell me how he took on himself a quest, and the quest was to find who killed his father. And when he had his magazine, George, in the 70s, that was his whole ambition. No, it was in the 80s, I'm sorry, in the 80s. And he was deciding to run for president so he could get deep inside again and find out what had really happened. And, of course, the tragedy was that he died in that plane crash off of, up in Massachusetts near the Kennedy home. Yeah. So it was this kind of contact I did have with the Kennedys, and it was really heartwarming. And when you stop them, like I'm doing right now, and think about it, I mean, you get real emotional about it. Because I didn't call anybody. I was not about to call them. And this was, such a horrible thing that it was not something I could speak to them anyway. Of course, I didn't really go out and dig up evidence anywhere. It was coming to me, and this was part of the history that I got from what I would say are really key members of the family. Oh, and one other thing, Meg had written a book about it, mainly about her relations with John Jr., and she knew Caroline real well. It was part of the family. I mean, she was there with John Jr. in the apartment they had there on Fifth Avenue in New York, and they were friends. And Meg told Caroline, well, first of all, about my book. And Caroline had written a little note on that. Should we be interested in this? Well, this note was written back in 2005. 10 years later, she was still interested. Meg went to Caroline, and Caroline said, write your book. I'm not going to take a stand on it one way or another. Very important, because the Kennedys had uniformly avoided any public appearance. that they believed there was a conspiracy. But again, you come deep inside these families, deep inside this fog of history, and you get the story, the history.
Yeah. So now, do you think this has obviously changed the world and changed America? Do you think this could happen today in the same sort of way?
I do indeed, and you really ask a really good question. A lot of people think it's just a matter of digging into the crime scene and figuring out what happened, or speculating on who was doing what when they don't know some of the things I was able to find. They said, let me put it this way. When Kennedy was assassinated and they had the funeral, this magnificent funeral in his memory in Washington, and the Warren Commission comes along and does a very bad job, you don't get closure. Any family goes through it. They have to have some kind of closure to know what happened and to believe it. They couldn't believe the Warren Commission. That's why 80% of America at one point had nothing to do with Warren. I think it's dropped down to 65 now, but there's still a big number that are uncertain, willing to learn what the history really is. So when you have this bad feeling, it keeps going. Carter referred to a malaise. The way I look at it, it became banal. That is, corruption became acceptable. The banality of corruption was okay, and it has just gotten worse and worse. And so what part of my book is to take a few steps to change that. And the biggest one, in fact, I may be releasing it here as part of an advanced part out of the book in the next few weeks, is a proposal for a code of conduct so that federal employees will be committed to service. In other words, what Kennedy really highlighted in his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Service. And that means making sure that everybody discloses everything, that federal employees can't lie. And here's an interesting thing here. Few people know this, but we can't lie to the federal government. If a federal agent asks us something, we got to tell them the truth, or we could be indicted, and many people have been. But they can lie to us all the time.
Yeah.
I think we need a little bit of equality of purpose here. They can't lie, we can't lie. We need them to be not committed to any political party, nonpartisan. We need to be sure that they're fair to us, and none of them should be able to make a fortune to do what Johnson did, or he ended up with nothing.
Yeah.
But had at the end of it all a state worth $80 million. You can't prosper. You got to disclose it, and you can't. If you want to make money, you can't do it in service to the government. You can go out in the private economy and make whatever money you think you can make. So I think that, and there are 4 points here in this proposal to try and bring us out of what I call the banality of corruption, which has gotten worse, in my opinion, and I think it reflects what you were asking. It was a very bad event in American history, and it hadn't gotten any better, and something needs to be done.
Yeah, definitely. The government is not working for the people anymore.
It's amazing how it's not, too, and how it's so open and obvious, and yet people just seem to sit back and say, it's okay. Politicians, we know they're corrupt. We have to live with it.
Yeah.
I don't think we have to live with it.
No, I know. It's sort of... that's what I mean by... that's why I get disheartened when I look back at the times of the 60s, where people took more pride in what was going on, I think.
Pride is a good word. Be very proud of what we were doing.
Yeah.
We could.
Yeah.
We need to get back to that.
Oh, yeah, I agree. So now for... Whatever happened to Johnson? Just one last... How did his life end?
Well, it was a real massive depression when he left the White House. And he was concerned, of course, about protecting his legacy, but his legacy was shot. And they built a library for him, but then he gave up, literally, and started smoking again and all. But he also, and a measure of how he ended up, there is one small monument to him in Washington. There won't be any more. And how else did he end up? Well, back in Texas, they made his ranch a monument site. Visitors opened and all. Very few people go there. More people go to the 6th floor or to Dallas, to the site of the assassination. Far more than ever dream of going to see anything about Johnson, even in Texas. So I'd say his legacy, it ended up where it should be. He doesn't have a legacy, really. And the question becomes, what do you do about it? And in all my working on this, given some pretty, I won't say deep thought or anything, but giving a lot of thought to it, it's pretty apparent that it's such a high drama that goes back to some of the Greek dramas and some of the Shakespearean dramas, with those same things coming out, and the good guys are identified, the bad guys are identified, and the bad guys lose. It's probably too late now to really do much constructive about what Johnson did, but we can surely move away from him.
Well, yeah, definitely. And I think there'd be a big relief. It still holds in a lot of people's minds. It seems like still a lot of people don't believe Oswald did it. If he was a part of it, he was just used. And there's still a huge amount of people that would like a sense of, I don't want to use the word closure, but just a sense of some truth on it.
I really think that's right, and where I find it when I'm out talking about it, kids in high school now are a perfect example. They would like to know what really happened, and they have a real good idea of what really happened, but it needs to be, how can I say it, accepted.
Yeah.
There are just a few people in Washington that refuse to accept it. And all I can say about them is they have not been very persuasive.
No. And so now a lot of the files still aren't released, and they're not going to be for a number of years, right?
Right.
So,
That's, see, and again, and you're really hitting hard on me here, because that's in my sequel. We need, and I'm going to do it as a formal complaint to law enforcement, that there are some things you need to find now. One of them is I'd like to see recover the penthouse records I mentioned earlier, if they're still available. Billy Saul Estes has some records that need to be recovered. There is one record of a tape he made in a hotel in Austin, where Johnson said, and Estes said he recorded it, where Johnson said, kill Kennedy. And this is another little quirk in Texas history. Billy Saul Estes, who tried to record everything, he carried a little briefcase around. Of course, back in those days, they didn't have the little ones we have now. You had to have a bigger apparatus.
Yeah.
And this ranger he worked with did the same thing, Clint Peoples. He would record everything, and the story goes that he and Billy Saul Estes, Peoples and Estes, would go out in the woods to talk to each other. Both of them would record each other talking.
Well,
that's the kind of, so you're asked about evidence, that's the kind of evidence. Supposedly 3 copies of this tape. And we know people who've touched on it or know something about it, but I don't have subpoena power.
No.
I can't go in there and I can't sneak in and or anything like that. but the FBI can,
Yeah.
and the police department in Dallas can. So yes, we need to bring out this evidence. And again, you've got some big files with the CIA that need to come out.
So why isn't it that they won't release it?
That's a real good question.
Yeah.
I don't know why, except you can say they don't want to uncover it. With the CIA, now there is a special feature to their non-participation. They set up it was called a Project Mockingbird. They deny it exists, we never did this. But back in '48, when they set up the CIA formally, they had a fellow in charge of propaganda. Now, of course, CIA is supposed to operate only outside the United States. They operated inside the United States, and they had some of the top newspapers working with them. The New York Times, CBS, all worked with them to tell the CIA story about what was happening in the Cold War and why it was important to the United States, and what was happening in the United States that was important to the United States. And guess what they think is really important? That there was one guy doing the shooting of in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd. They were told to quit doing that. It happens every time somebody comes out with something new that the CIA will issue a statement. We didn't have anything to do with it. Here's why.
Yeah.
So you ask about, how it can get stopped. It is, and we know how it's getting stopped.
Yeah.
By something, of course, that doesn't exist. Project Mockingbird. Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
So let's tell the listeners how they can get a hold of you if they want to talk to you or email you, and also the books you have out and how they can get them.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Barr McClellan, and I have the listing in Wikipedia, and you can find out a lot there. I'm a business consultant in addition to doing the research here, and I have offices in New York and Princeton, and right now in Houston too. I'm staying busy. Our home is in Gulfport, though, Mississippi, and I'm pretty well available. The first book, Blood, Money, and Power, is still out. It's still available, and it's been one of those selling items, word of mouth, and it just keeps moving. It's out in soft cover also, and Verdict, which is the sequel, is under contract, and we're trying to get it released on May 29th, which is John Kennedy's birthday. Trying to get away from Dallas and the assassination scene and turn to something that's more appropriate, I think.
Yeah.
And we're hoping to get it out. But in the meantime, there are going to be some releases of parts of the book, and they'll be out on Facebook or by email. And I'm open about this. I think disclosure is very important. I've said that, and I got to live by it, and I do. But I'm on email. It's barrmcclellan@att.net, and I try to respond to everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you can get a lot sometimes, so yeah, it takes time.
Oh, but we are coming out. Well, I've got the book right in front of me right now, JFK, L.B.J, which is options that have been taken on the book and by producers in Hollywood, and there's 7 treatments that I've worked up. But treatment is kind of an outline of how the scenes should go to tell the history, and we want to get that out and invite people to participate in either questions or in suggestions for working up a little working script, and that we're hoping to get out. Maybe another month or two, but it like I say, it's sitting in front of me right now.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds excellent. And we'll post everything on our website as well as our Facebook, and any links to you as well. And look forward to talking to you again about Verdict and about anything else you come up with.
Well, thank you, Alan. I really enjoyed this because every time I go over it, it helps focus my thinking. And I'm focused a lot better now. Thank you.
Well, good. I'm glad I did something good.
Oh, you did a lot good. Keep up the good work, and I hope to be back.
Well, thank you. You will be, sure.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.